Hey everyone, it's Raghu back with Mindrolling, and I'm just sitting here meeting for the first time Joshua Brown, who is a doctor and who had an extraordinary experience, and he shared it with the world in a book called Proving a Miracle, Unlocking the Power of Prayer to Heal. And so we were just I was catching Joshua up around, my history with Ram Dass, which all of you know about, but I was giving him a little bit of a primer as to what that was, and we ended I said, well, let's not talk anymore because we'll share it with everybody, but the book is about healing. It's about miracles. It's about attending to the ways in which we can heal ourselves in all ways. And so we're going to get into it. But what I was sharing was, well, first let's talk about what happened to you that propelled you to write this book. Can you tell that story? I mean, it's pretty unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Raghu, Raghu.
Yeah,
hope I said that right.
it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it's not how I envisioned my life going, really. I was 30 years old, and I was a postdoctoral fellow studying cognitive neuroscience. I had become fascinated with the human brain and how it works, and my undergraduate training was engineering and mechanical engineering. And so I got fascinated with the brain as a machine. And so at the time, when I was 30, I was doing functional brain imaging in humans, trying to understand how the different parts of the brain work, and especially the higher cognitive functions, that is in the frontal lobe, how we monitor our own behavior. And I was building computer models, trying to simulate the function of the brain, using methods that were kind of precursors to what today is the foundation of artificial intelligence. And so as I was doing that, my wife was pregnant. She was just about to give birth to our first child. And I went to bed one night, and when I woke up the next morning, I wasn't in my bed. I was in the back of an ambulance. And it was the most disorienting thing in my life. I had no idea how I'd gotten there. And the paramedics had put an oxygen mask on me, and I had tubes everywhere. And they said, well, sir, you've had a seizure. And that's what had happened. So in the middle of the night, my wife heard me scream and looked over, and I was unconscious and seizing, and so she called 911. And so I awoke in the back of this ambulance, and it gradually became clear what had happened. And so they took me to the ER and did a CT scan on my head. And they said, well, there's no, we don't see like immediate brain bleed or something. So you can go home, but you need to follow up with a neurologist. So I did. I saw a neurologist who ordered some scans, and 4 days later, my wife gave birth to our first child. And so she was in the maternity wing of the hospital recovering from childbirth, and I was at the same time then walking over to the radiology wing having MRIs done on my head. And so the irony was that here I was, a neuroscientist who does brain scans on other people, and now I'm the one in the scanner, and I'm the patient. And so when my newborn daughter was 2.5 weeks old, I got the diagnosis that I had a brain tumor. And I knew immediately that this was really bad, and it became clear very quickly that I would most likely not live more than a few more years, even with the best medical treatment. And so in an instant, my whole world just came crashing down. It just disintegrated. And I thought to myself, is this how it ends? Is this, I live a couple more years and that's it. And I never see my daughter grow up, and my wife's a widow, and And is that how this ends? And so I became desperate, and I looked for whatever medicine could offer, and I realized that while I appreciated the medical care, it wasn't necessarily going to save my life. And so at that point, I began reaching out to friends, looking for what else, is there something else? Is there something that can help me? And so I was talking with people in my church, and they said, well, there's some prayer meetings you could go to, and there seem to be people there who experience remarkable healings, and so you might check that out. And that began a long journey that I'm still on today.
Oh, wow. Really? Actually, let me reference something from the book, from you.
Hmm.
Proving a Miracle is my story. It also explores the way in which our beliefs, and our spiritual beliefs in particular, might affect our health. I began by asking basic questions about why scientists have been reluctant to study spiritual beliefs and what we know scientifically about the impact of the spiritual on our physical selves. How do we form and maintain beliefs from a neuroscience perspective? And how do those beliefs in turn affect our health? How do we adjust or update our beliefs, especially as we seek new experiences or when new information comes to light? So there's a lot in here, a lot that you have shared, in so many different ways. And you also talk about your faith
Hmm.
as being central to being able to discover new modems for you, shall we say, models, modem,
Hmm.
in which to feel like there was a path, a healing path there.
Hmm.
And so Joshua and I just met, and I was explaining a little to him about we actually have a lot of cross current, even though you're a devout Christian.
Hmm.
I grew up Jewish, left that. It didn't satisfy me. And then I grew up in the era of psychedelics. Of course, that's where Ram Dass initially came from.
Hmm.
And the natural tendency at that point, at least for me, was to look to the East. And that is what I did. And I was very fortunate to meet this incredible being through Ram Dass, and a bunch of Westerners, just a few hundred, not that many, went over to India over a period of the first few years of the 70s.
Hmm.
And first of all, just in terms of the one thing that got broken for us was any kind of separation between one tradition or another. And this was, he would say to us that there's only one thing going. There's one. It's a one. You know,
Hmm.
Buddha over here and Krishna over there and Christ over here and so on. But it comes from that one source. It is only that. And that's all he talked about was Christ when I first met him. So you think Hindu guru, and that's not what it was at all. So just in connection to your deep connection to Christ,
Hmm.
and then that we learned what prayer could be
Hmm.
in so many different ways, and we learned that what we thought was real, our minds, the story we tell ourselves, and our habitual patterns, and so on, that is not real, and miracles are real, and
Hmm.
and all of what that is. So, just all of this is only to say, people might say, well, really come from different worlds. Not
Hmm.
really.
Hmm.
And that struck me when we first met, just over the first few minutes.
Hmm.
So I think it would be great, talk about the new technologies that are out there, really via neuroscience. And I mean, I've talked to different scientists and so on this podcast, and the reality is we can change. We can change. This is real. Can you talk about how you related to that part? I mean, your scientific work with, of course, the reality of inner work, prayer.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so there's a long history of the interactions of science and religion and spirituality. And I think at least within the West, there's been a certain history of animosity, really, where
Mm,
if you go back, you go back as far as Galileo, for example, and you have the Catholic Church is at odds with these newer scientific findings, and you
mm,
can trace that up through Darwin, right? And you have the Scopes trial, and you have even into the 80s and 90s this undercurrent of sort of competition and even animosity between some of the faith communities, especially I think within Christianity and the scientists. And I of course live in both worlds, and I noticed a change, or I would say around 2005, and that was the year in which pretty much the last court case on some of these religion versus science culture wars was basically settled, and the culture wars over creation evolution specifically kind of receded. And it was about that time that Richie Davidson published that landmark paper on the effects of meditation on health outcomes, and looking at immune system
mm,
function. and
mm-hmm,
and so I think there was a turning point around that time where it started to become more mainstream acceptable within science to study religion and to study spirituality and to study the effects of spiritual beliefs on health. And and so it was in that context that you have an explosion of new technologies, and particularly functional brain imaging. So it was around the late 1990s that functional MRI gave us this new ability to look at the activity of individual parts of the brain with much better time resolution, with much better spatial resolution, and to begin to ask questions about how various cognitive practices, and now including beliefs and spirituality, affect the brain directly.
mm,
And so from about I'd say from about 2000, and by 2005, you start to get this increase in neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience studies of how our beliefs influence our brains, and how those beliefs in turn influence not just the brain, but the body and our health. And so I think that combination of events, this turn in the culture, the sort of rapprochement of religion and science, I think that all came together to the point that now it's much more common. So, for example, if you just do a search for, um, say, meditation and fMRI, or meditation and brain imaging,
mm.
there's a massive amount of studies, and they've almost all been done in the last few decades. And so
Sure.
to me, that points to this turn in the culture to where it's now, I think the line is that if you're doing a scientific study with the goal of proving that a particular faith tradition is metaphysically or cosmologically correct over others, that will ruffle some feathers. But on the other hand, there are all kinds of empirical questions. That is, questions about whether a particular spiritual practice will improve our health. Those are empirical questions, and you can answer those. You can investigate them without necessarily making a claim that, one particular faith tradition is now, the correct one, as it were. And I think those empirical questions are very relevant because they get at questions about how the things that we do uh, all the time, daily,
Mm.
spiritual practices, how they affect our brains, how they affect our health, and it's striking to me how acceptable that is, and how much an area of current interest that is, and it's an area that I've obviously become more interested in and started doing research in as well.
Mm. Yet maybe neuroscience, the reality that we can change. Talk a little about what are the ingredients there that allow that to happen, and what's the interaction that a person needs to make. And as far as I'm concerned, when we talk about healing, there's healing of the body, and then there's healing of the mind,
Mm.
and all of that, just as or more important, really. So yeah, how does that process? How can that process work for an individual? We're sitting here with an audience of people interested in something like this. What do how do
Hmm.
interact?
Yeah, well, I think
Well,
that's a
not
question.
with Claude right now. No.
That's a question that could go in any number of different directions,
Yeah.
because there's all kinds of different things that you can do that will influence your brain and your health. And I think one of the things that I focused on in the book is the question of how beliefs
Mm.
affect our health specifically. And so there are all kinds of spiritual practices. There's prayer, there's meditation, but beliefs, I think, get to the core of things in a lot of ways. And I've been in meetings where people will say, "Well, you just have to believe, right? You got to believe," and and in a sense, that's true, but I don't necessarily find it all that helpful, in the sense that,
Uh-huh.
well, if I believe something, I believe it. If I don't believe it, I don't believe it. And I don't want to sort of try to trick myself into believing something that isn't
Yeah. No.
true.
Mm.
And yet, what we believe has powerful effects on health. So, as an example of that, as I was looking into cases of healing. I was obviously desperate to find healing for myself. And so I was looking into cases where people claim to experience healing, and, for like years of chronic, high level pain just gone. And I would hear these experiences and ask, so what's going on? How does that work? And so it turns out that, I mean, we talk about the placebo effect. And in medicine, it's sort of spoken of as kind of this, unwanted stepchild, where it's this thing that gets in the way of measuring the effectiveness of what we really care about, which is some new drug.
Mm.
And, I say that with a little bit of sarcasm, but I think uh, the placebo effects are real, and there's not just one. There's many different kinds of placebo effects, and all of these derive from what we believe.
Mm.
And so, for example, if I rub hand lotion on your hand and tell you that this is a powerful pain relieving cream, then if I then apply a mild electrical shock, which, and this is something we do in my laboratory at the university, we
Oh yeah.
will apply electrical shocks and scan people's brain activity, and look at, for example, how the brain processes pain. Um, then if I tell you that this cream is going to relieve the pain, the vast majority of people will experience reduced pain from that. And so you can draw a direct line from what we believe about something to the effects it has on our bodies and our health. And so, so if we I forgot where I was going with that, but
Well, more about, the actions that one can take
yeah,
to
yeah,
actually effect change in oneself.
yeah. And so I think it turns out that uh, the beliefs that we have come from experience, and I think there are people who argue that, well, what I believe I believe this because of this theological argument, and I believe this because the sacred text says this. But ultimately, our beliefs derive from our experience.
Hmm.
And so to tell someone, well, you should believe this, well, if it doesn't match your experience, you're not going to get very far with that. And so in my case, what I did practically was I I I sought places where people were claiming to experience these kinds of miraculous healings that I had been hearing about. I tried to immerse
Hmm.
myself in these kinds of environments. And I had up to that point never really heard of what I considered a credible report of a miraculous healing experience. It just wasn't part of my life experience or my faith traditions, the churches I was a part of. It wasn't really a thing. And so as I began to pursue these things, I would go to all kinds of meetings and gatherings, and I would watch people get prayed for. I would experience it myself. I would pray with other people, and I found that there were many people claiming to experience these kinds of dramatic healings.
Hmm.
And the more I heard that, the more it sort of shifted my own beliefs, because now my experience reflected that these things are fairly common. And it became easier to believe that remarkable, even miraculous healings happen, not as a kind of effort to believe, but as simply reflecting the experience I have. So I think practically, you are what you eat, and your beliefs reflect the experiences that you have. And so if you want to develop more nuanced beliefs in a certain direction, you have to immerse yourself in experiences that match those beliefs.
Hmm. Yeah. Community.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we find that to be the truest measure of. Ram Dass came back from India when he first came back, so he started talking about his experience and all, and that's why some of us, a bunch of us, met him. And
Hmm.
then much later, but he was told by the guru Maharaji,
Hmm.
"Don't talk about me in the West." That's all he did. He couldn't stop himself. So that's all he did. And I asked him just before he died, actually, "Why'd you do that?" And he said, "I had a jewel. How could I not share it?"
Hmm.
That is central to what we aspire to. Our foundation, this podcast network, and retreats, and everything we do.
Hmm.
That is exactly what you express is what we feel deeply as well. That people experiencing each other,
Hmm.
and you start to radiate that love,
Yeah.
that caring, and so on. And
Yeah.
so what you're saying is that is the change. That is the way that your brain can actually change, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you see remarkable healing experiences, you have these almost transcendental experiences, how can you not talk about that? Like, how can you not? I mean, I found it very difficult. And of course, around the university, as a professor, I have a job to do. I show up, I do my job, I try to do it well. I'm curious. And at the same time, especially as I would travel and I would see these, remarkable healings, blind people are starting to see, and I was very conscious that I don't want to talk about things in a way that's going to alienate people,
Mm.
right? And at the same time, I found it very difficult not to just say, "Oh, wow, I just saw
Yeah, yeah,
this
absolutely.
amazing, I had this amazing experience." And so I basically tried to find places where I could speak freely and basically, be who I was in terms of the experiences that I'd had.
Mm.
And
Interesting thing it's about I think, a close friend of yours, a young man who got very sick as well and passed.
yeah,
And your question was, you know, how does this happen to one person and not another?
yeah,
And one little anecdote story.
yeah. Yeah, Andrew Sneckvik was a good friend of mine, and he was the best man in my wedding in
Mm.
1998. And I had been friends with him for a number of years, and I had this was in Boston, and after I finished graduate school, my wife and I moved away, and I kept in touch with him. And a few years after we moved, I got word that he was diagnosed with metastatic colon cancer. And so it was devastating. He had three young kids, and so he was diagnosed, I think, shortly after I was with a brain tumor. And so we kept in touch, and he would he gave me some suggestions early on about some prayer groups that I might want to visit, which I did, and found that helpful. And I flew out and visited him. I prayed with him. I offered to, I said, let's go together to some of these prayer meetings. And I think so I would offer to, I went out to visit him. At a certain point, it seemed that he uh, he wanted to be healed, but I think he didn't really expect that he was going to be healed.
Uh-huh.
And I mean no disrespect or judgment or anything on that. I think that's just honestly
Human.
where he was. Yeah, I mean that's and I in a way I think I thought a lot about hope because and I think hope is a two-edged sword because on the one hand, if you have hope, that can keep you going. It can lift your spirits. But hope is also costly and it's risky because if you hope for something, you can be disappointed. But if you don't hope for anything, there's a certain sort of paradoxical sense of safety in that you are protected from being disappointed. You're protected from the pain of disappointment. And so I think at a certain point, I had to make a choice. Do I choose hope and the cost and the risk and the possibility of disappointment? And, not to mention the cost and time and effort of pursuing healing, pursuing miracles. Or do I sort of give up and get ready to pass? And I had to make a choice. And I think everyone who faces this has to make a choice. And so ultimately, I don't know why I was healed and why Andrew wasn't. I don't know. And I think anyone who claims to know doesn't really know. There's a mystery there.
Yeah.
But what I do know is that I've seen a lot of people who have experienced healing, and the people who have experienced healing for the most part are the ones that have very actively sought it, have done costly things, who have pursued it, who have maintained hope, who have sort of shown this kind of grit in the face of all of it. And there's no guarantee, right? But I do see a correlation there.
Yeah. I have close to a teacher who's a Zen teacher out west, and I think it was on a podcast, or she was close to Ram Dass, and we talked about hope, and very adjacent to how you just expressed it. And she said, "Well, I prefer an add-on to this word, wise hope, because hope in itself means for most people there's going to be an outcome that you're going to want to have that outcome natural. wise hope allows for the mystery to be present, basically. So I
Hmm.
always loved that
Yeah.
catchphrase. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing about one person survives and one person does not. Of course, in the East, karma is a word that we don't really understand that word because it's
Hmm.
not rational. You know, it's very difficult. I
Hmm.
mean, we can approach it, and I've spent a lot of time with people
Hmm.
talking about it. But this particular being in India had the ability to heal people.
Hmm.
And so somebody came up to him and said, "So and so is really got sick, and can you help them? You can help them, you know." And he acknowledged it, but he never did a thing. And that person passed. And then the person who told me this story, who was a mentor, very close, he said, "If you have no idea of what a person's past, present, future, you know, beyond this life, whatever it is. Of course, this is something, you know, the Buddhists and Hindus believe in reincarnation."
Hmm.
And it just struck me, that story. We don't, again, it's back to the mystery. We have no idea what's right for anybody. I mean, Ram Dass used to get a lot of mail, and people would be in touch with him because he worked with dying people. That was a big thing that he did in his lifetime. And they were asking for help and so on. And some of them were young, you know. I remember in particular one young man died in maybe surfing in Maui or something, you know. He got caught in the ocean, and his parents were so bereft. And one of the things he said, look, everybody comes in to this life, and there's a purpose there. And to become free, to be kinder, more compassionate, more. I mean, this is our purpose. And it's 13 years. You're saying that, you know, you're going to put a time stamp on this as to what he needed to move forward, you know, that kind of a
Hmm.
thing. So I love the reference back to the mystery, which, you know, we've got to approach in a friendly way and not in an antagonistic way. Anyhow.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the I think there is certainly value in the kind of persistence, the kind of hope, kind of grit. Um, and I think it's possible to have both. It's possible to have the persistence, um, and it's possible to hold that along with but we don't know. And
Hmm.
and I think personally, I found that painful because
Yeah.
I desperately wanted to survive. I
Yeah.
mean, not
Yeah.
just for me, for the sake of my kids, my wife, and and so I think that was really, in some ways, the most painful part of my whole life was just living every moment with that thought that I might die very soon. And I remember thinking I would pay such a huge price to just to be free of that thought, that just ever
Mm.
present dread.
Oh boy.
But I found that's where a lot of these prayer meetings, they sort of gave me the hope. They gave me a kind of, in some ways, a relief from that constant otherwise dread. And so I think that was part of that was part of what the benefit was of it.
Mm. Yeah. Interesting. You also talk in the book about mindfulness and meditation,
Mhm.
which is not particular. Well, in some ways, in different communities, Christian communities, there is that. But you certainly got involved with it. I think partially instigated by the fMRI work that was going on with Richie Davidson and others, right? But
Yeah,
you
so
said, Go.
Yeah, I haven't directly done studies of mindfulness myself with imaging. I've certainly followed the literature, and I think a lot of those studies, as I said earlier, they're really pioneering in building that bridge to studying the effects of spirituality on health and on our brains.
Mm.
So yeah, so I have a lot of respect for that work, even though I haven't done it directly myself.
Yeah, the question you pose is whether mindfulness can be effectively uncoupled from its religious roots remains contested. Yeah, talk about that. I have a hard time with that. I mean, the meditation practice that I learned in India is really, it's called Vipassana. It's very common now in the West, and it's just following your breath initially. I mean, there's more advanced stages of it. But and they tell you when you start, no gurus, no nothing, no images, nothing. Just sit there and follow that breath and do the practice.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, it completely it opened up vistas for me that weren't that open before, in terms of like heart, in the opening, that place deep inside of us that can open to who we more truly are. It was so I don't get the uncoupling thing.
So I think that there's several different questions here, and that gets at one particular. So there are questions about what are the health effects, what are the neural effects. But I think this gets at the question of whether the practices of, for example, meditation, whether it's vipassana or even like MBSR, whether those are whether those are spiritual practices or whether they're sort of a a completely natural practice that is not intrinsically tied to a
Yeah.
religious view or spirituality. And my what I said there was not, I didn't write that as a normative statement to say that, these things, are always religious or they definitely aren't. It was more of a statement about how these things are perceived in the culture. And so in that, I cite scholars of religion, scholars of Buddhism, for example, who have basically understood, just to take Buddhism, for example, as um, they'll speak of not just Buddhism as a single construct, but as multiple Buddhisms, and and some of them understand sort of the ongoing development of, for example, MBSR as a
Maybe
development of
tell
an
people what that is.
yeah, mindfulness-based stress reduction. So this is the very popular 8-week course of practice developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn.
Mm-hmm.
And and in Kabat-Zinn's writings, for example, so if you look at the recent book Altered Traits, they'll describe how in a lot of the early work, for example, looking at the effects of mindfulness on health, there was very much a treatment of it as this is a practice that is not intrinsically tied to a particular spiritual tradition. And uh, at the same time, in other writings, even Kabat-Zinn himself has said things to the effect of, and I want to be careful to quote him accurately,
Mm.
but that his goal was not to remove the aspects of the Dharma, but rather to distill the 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 essence of the Dharma and to make it as easily accessible as possible to the Western audience. And so uh, And so that's why I say my point was not to take a position on whether these things can or cannot be that
Sorry.
is the spiritual and the practices themselves can or cannot be separated, but rather to point out that within the culture today there are groups that claim that you can separate the spiritual aspects of a practice from the physical,
Yeah.
the motions, and there are those who claim that you can't.
Mm.
And I haven't taken a position on that. What I try to do is to outline the scholarly context and the cultural discussion that's really ongoing on that.
Yeah. We used to hear about when mindfulness was first more being popularized. Yeah, no, it's great. And these stockbrokers, boy, they're really doing well because they're able to really focus in using their mindfulness practice. It's America, or the West is that Western concept. By the way, we both love this one book. It's called Altered Traits.
Hmm.
Science Reveals How Meditation Changes Your Mind, Brain, and Body, which was Richie Davidson
Hmm.
and a good friend of mine, Daniel Goleman. And he
Hmm.
mentioned in here that Danny hung out with yogis and lama. Well, we were together with Ram Dass in the early 70s. And that's
Ah.
that.
So
Yeah.
you were part of that whole mix back then.
Yeah.
I didn't
Mm.
realize I knew all that was going on at the same time, but I didn't know who all was involved, was part of that mix.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a small world.
Yeah. No, that's why I looked at this and went, well, that's good. And
Uh-huh.
by the way, in our show notes, people, Mr. Producer, of course, you're going to put Proving a Miracle and the links to it, but put in Altered Traits. It really can give you a connectivity to the possibilities of the neuroplasticity of our brains.
Mm.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think let's talk about. There's one thing here that is really worth talking about. You talk about your diagnosis triggered some cognitive processes, right?
Hmm.
Which in turn led to predictions of what was going to happen next. And you say these cognitive processes are not just thoughts. They're
Hmm.
biological processes in my brain. Can you tear that apart a little bit?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been studying for a number of years is basically trying to understand the brain as a machine. And and when you take that approach, one of the principles that really stands out, and there are whole fields of neuroscience and theories developed around this, that cast the brain as in large part a machine that tries to predict what's going to happen next. And so the basic function then is there's a whole bunch of things that have happened in the past, and there are things that are happening now. And what the brain is automatically doing without you even trying is trying to make a prediction about what's going to happen next. Could
Mhm.
it, so it might make a prediction that, this thing is going to happen with some probability, but maybe this other thing's going to happen with some probability. And you do that constantly without thinking about it necessarily, without trying. And we found, so for example, we did some functional brain imaging in people, and we gave them a task where in some conditions they were a little more likely to make a mistake than in other conditions. And we gave them very subtle cues that would allow them to make predictions about how likely they were to make a mistake. And we found that when they were more likely to make a mistake, there were certain parts of the brain that were already very sensitive to mistakes that started to get more active. And yet, when we asked the participants, "Did you notice anything about this?" They denied it. They were not aware that their own brains were making predictions about what was going to happen next, and specifically that they were more likely to make a mistake in certain circumstances. And so we could see that their brain was picking up on this. It was making these predictions, even though they weren't aware of it. And others have found similar kinds of results. And so it turns out that this kind of prediction is exactly the building block you need to build an internal model of the world. So another way to think about that is our ability to navigate the world successfully depends on our ability to understand how the world works. And if you have a machine that makes predictions about how the world works and updates the predictions to be better when you make a mistake in those predictions, then over time you will develop a machine that accurately predicts what's going to happen next. And in the course of that, it does so by developing an accurate model of how the world works. And what we found, what generally seems to be the case, is that that's what our brains do. They form an internal model of how the world works by continuously making predictions, seeing where those predictions are wrong, and then updating the connections within the brain to make better predictions next time. And this is the same kind of mechanism that today's artificial intelligence uses to train itself. So another part of my research involves working with artificial intelligence and the kinds of computational models that are the foundation of artificial intelligence. And the fundamental element of those is that they learn by making predictions. So if you use ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or any of these AIs, you're using a system that has started by being fed in, say, a sentence from a book. And it will then be forced to predict what's the next word in the sentence, what's the next thing that's going to happen. And the model will make some prediction. It's probably wrong. And then there will be a signal that says, you predicted this, but this is what actually happened. And that will cause the model to update itself to make a more accurate prediction next time. And when you repeat that process over almost everything on the internet, untold, zillions of times, eventually you end up with a very good model of where you can predict what's going to happen next. And so AI works that way. And it seems that our brains also work that way in large part. And so that's what I'm getting at with so to bring this back to our health. So something happens, you get a diagnosis, and your brain automatically begins to make a prediction about what's going to happen next, that this is bad, I might die within a few years. And it's difficult or impossible to stop that prediction process because your brain is hardwired to do that. And so that, of course, can lead to issues, right? Because, if we get a bad diagnosis and we think, we're going to die, then that prediction also signals all kinds of stress responses, which over long periods of time, are bad for our health. And so you end up with this vicious cycle where you get some bad news from the doctor, and then you think, this could end badly. And so you start making predictions about how it's going to end badly, which increases your stress level, increases cortisol, it increases other adrenaline. And over time, these can be damaging to our health.
Yeah. Wow. That is something else related to the AI thing. Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible, Joshua. We're running out of time a little bit, and so there's a lot to unpack in all of this.
Yeah.
The gap, just moving to something sideways a little bit, the gap between possessing a set of beliefs and exacerbating one's heart disease or cancer might have sounded laughably large at first. Hopefully, however, it's clear now that this gap isn't as wide as originally thought. Our cognitive map or set of beliefs leads us to make predictions, which is just what you just expressed, right?
Yeah,
And these
exactly.
predictions trigger specific physiological activity and emotions in the brain. The resulting processes triggered by these thoughts and emotions, positive and negative, can then affect our health, which you just recounted.
Yeah.
I go back to mindfulness, the
Mhm.
usefulness of mindfulness to allow, okay, this prediction happens, you get a bad diagnosis. Immediately you jump to the worst thing, it's human. And mindfulness allows for some spaciousness around that to prevent it moving into what Sharon Salzberg, I don't know if you know who Sharon is, but part of the triumvirate that brought Vipassana back to the States, Jack Kornfield, people like that.
Mhm.
She would say, this is piling on.
Mhm.
You take that one thing, that one thought, which just propels you into outer space and predictions of so volatile that they bring in everything else in your life that you're unhappy about or that you're having a problem with and create this bomb that goes off. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's why I think the efficacy of mindfulness, which has to be based in a meditative practice in order to get one pointed at the very least, is
Yeah.
so important. And now, and you saying this makes it even, the idea of what that predilection is. And the weird thing is how that's what's happening with AI, training AI.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So I think there's an interesting, as I'm a Christian, and so I've sort of I approached my illness and pursuit of healing from mostly a Christian perspective. I certainly appreciate insights from other traditions, and one of the things I noticed, and my wife's Professor Candy Gunther Brown is also a professor of religious studies, so we have many conversations about this, and it seems to me there's basically two different approaches to the problem of suffering, which is in the sense that this bomb that you spoke of is sort of this vicious cycle where you get some bad news
Mm-hmm.
and you experience suffering because you, on the one hand, very much want to live, but on the other
Yeah.
hand, you're concerned you might not. And the space between what you expect to happen and what you want to happen is suffering, right? And so in the Buddhist Dharma, the Four Noble Truths are exactly about this, right? That there is that it's the attachment, that is the wishing things were different that causes the suffering. And so within the Buddhist traditions, the solution to suffering is to let go, right? To let go of that desire. And if you let go of the desire, that collapses the space between what you want to happen and where you predict, that is the predictions that your
Yeah.
brain is making about what will happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it interesting that there's kind of a contrast because within the Christian traditions that I was pursuing, the goal, the focus is not so much on the extinction of desire. So, in other words, the goal within the practices I was pursuing was not to collapse the space by extinguishing desire and removing attachment, but rather to pursue a space where there was hope, where there was an experience of miracles happening. There was an experience of recoveries in a way that shifted the predictions about how the illness was going to end, how my brain tumor was going to end,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that led me to predict that the outcome was going to be better than I might otherwise have. And so in a sense, the experience of seeing miracles shifted my predictions. It shifted me to make a more optimistic prediction.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, the experience of reducing suffering was about collapsing that space, not by removing attachment, but but by shifting the predictions I was making about
Mm,
how this was going to turn out.
yeah.
And so I think that, I say this not as as a value judgment, but more as an analysis, because I think there are points of commonality and there are points of difference in these different traditions. And it struck me that there's a common goal, which is to alleviate suffering. And what I find interesting is the different ways that cashes out in terms of practices.
Yeah. Although I am completely one with you, and especially it is something for, and we all have different chemistry and predilection to moving one way or another in our minds. Uh, at the same and for me, that is something I need to pursue because I am not naturally optimistic in my character, shall we say. And but I don't pay that much attention to it because all those years ago, fortunately, the surgeon cracked all of the ways in which I was solidified in my thinking about who I am.
Mm.
Thank
Mm.
God that. I don't take myself quite as seriously, but I do. I have that predilection. But I would still say that I am. The commitment. Go back to the Buddhist canon, and it's yes, attachment, yes, desire, yes, attachment. And I think a better word for it has been for me, and it's what I share, what we all share with people, is mindfulness of clinging, where you
Mm.
are absolutely clinging. And in that clinging, that spaciousness cannot be present. And
Mhm.
I think even with how you're expressing, once you see the reality of hope, the reality of being able to witness the mystery through a miracle, shall we say.
Mhm.
And I've fortunately seen many of them,
Mhm.
through this whole experience. I still think that that's why we kind of represent that combination of love, hope, through the expression of Hinduism in particular,
Mhm.
and the Buddhist, which is the expression of, let's be mindful, and we are dealing with suffering and clinging and working on that. So the combination of the two, to me, is effective.
Mhm.
But that's me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So glad to have you with us, Joshua, Dr.
Yeah.
Brown.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, thank you, Raghu. It's been a pleasure.
Yes. And everybody, proving a miracle, there'll be, Joshua, you'll send me links, and we'll give you a link. Producers get a link to Altered Traits because that is central to some of what has been talked about here in the last hour. And go to BeHereNowNetwork.com/mindrolling and take advantage of the show notes and the links and everything, or just go to BeHereNowNetwork.com. And we have wonderful people like Ram Dass. And how about Alan Watts? Do you know Alan Watts' stuff?
I'm not familiar with him. No, not
Okay.
right off. Yeah.
You would enjoy Alan Watts.
Mm.
Okay. Yeah. And you can take a look at Ram Dass too.
Yeah.
But so, yes, we have Alan doing podcasts. Obviously he died a long time ago, but his son puts them together for us. So, well worth the visits. And we'll see you all next week. Thank you. Thanks, Joshua.